Hi and welcome to Gardening with DC. In today's seed series video, we're going to have a quick look at the 5 things you need to know to get started growing either a backyard lemon or indeed a backyard lime here in Sydney. Now, I think most of us are quite excited with the sort of the idea of having a backyard citrus. So the intention of the video is to hopefully turn those good ideas and good intentions into practical outcomes. So let's start off with knowing our plant. So our backyard citrus is a cultivated cropping plant. And what that means from a practical perspective is that though it's been cultivated, we as humans have sort of played around with it to ensure that we get a healthy crop of fruit. Now, that fiddling around, that cultivating element, what that means from a practical perspective is that there's quite deliberate inputs to get that output. So we've got to be conscious of those, and we'll deal with those shortly. So that's sort of point 1 is know your plant, cultivated cropping plant. Okay, point 2, having sort of got a little bit of extra knowledge there on our plant, let's throw it over to you, the gardener, and a couple of attributes that you need to have to be successful with your citrus. And it's going to be slightly odd because the first attribute that it's quite important to have is patience. All good gardeners should be relatively patient, and patience here. What that actually translates to, or what that actually means, is that our cropping plant, well, it's not going to be a great cropper. It's not really going to hit its full straps until about 7 years down the track. So what we need to do is we just need to show our plant a little bit of patience in terms of our expectations of when we get our crop. If you're popping it into the ground and you're thinking, oh right, okay, it's in the ground, so 5 o'clock next Friday we'll have a bumper crop, and we'll have gin and tonics all round, or pims and lemonade, whatever you fancy. Well, it's just not gonna happen. And from a practical perspective, what is a really good sort of gardening tip is that for the first few years, you don't want it overburdened with fruit, because you want the plant investing back in itself. So a good thing to do for the first few years is just to knock off flowers and fruit that get formed. Yes, have a little bit of fruit off there, but you don't want it overburdened. Okay, so that's sort of our first one, patience. And from a practical perspective, knocking off flowers and fruit in the early years, right? Now, having said you've got to be patient, you've also got to be active, right? So just bear this one in mind. You've got to be active as well, and we're going to deal with that sort of active element a little bit later on in the video on point 4 when we have a look at pests and diseases. But just for you, you've got to be patient and you've got to be active. Madness. All right. Let's deal with 3, and that's the inputs to ensure that we get this bumper crop. So what are those inputs? Well, obviously it's sun, it's soil, it's water, it's nutrition. So sun, we fiddled about with it, and what the fiddling about means is that we need to maximize its exposure to sun. So when you're putting into the garden, or if you're putting it into a pot on your balcony, just in terms of that situation, make sure it's ideally the maximum amount of sun that it can get in your garden. As sort of a minimum, really it needs to be 6 hours a day. Certainly if you put them into a spot where they're only getting a couple of hours a day, it's just not going to work. Okay, so from a sun perspective, try and maximize the exposure that the plant is getting. Soil, look, they're a really hungry plant. You want them producing this, so we've got to invest in the soil. So make sure when you're popping it into the ground or into a pot that you don't scrimp with that. Okay, we want a really nutritionally rich soil. Add manure, add compost. Okay. Water. So if we're sort of saying it's a very hungry plant, it sort of follows that it's probably going to be thirsty as well, and that is indeed the case. So when you're setting up, if you perhaps setting up with some drip irrigation, something like that, just be watering like every third day or something like that. Okay, it's a hungry and a thirsty plant, so it follows obviously with the nutrition that you're going to have to feed it relatively regularly as well. What I'd recommend when starting out is you just go and get a sort of a good reputable product from the garden centre, a granular feed, okay, and just follow the regime that granular feed recommends. You will need to feed it. You can't just pop it in the ground and forget about it. And as I say, be coming back. Oh well, we'll come back in 2 years' time and it'll be a bumper crop. You've got to be a bit active as well. We'll need a feed. Also, in just when you are popping it into the ground or into a pot on the balcony, just be aware that they don't appreciate too much wind as well. So if it was going in a sort of super windy spot, just have a look and work out sort of what you can do in terms of engineering a bit of barrier to it to protect. So whilst it has terrific strengths to be able to get this crop, it does have some weaknesses, and the weaknesses are fundamentally that it's pretty susceptible. They're pretty susceptible to pests and diseases, and this really sort of goes to the heart of this point too, where I was saying you've got to be patient, but you've got to be active as well, because you've got to monitor it, right? You've got to be looking at the plant once a week, having a look at the foliage, what's going on. So what are sort of some of the common pests and diseases? Well, leaf miner, whitefly, aphids, scale, sooty mold. The list is quite long. There are some absolute villains amongst it. So gall wasp, and probably from the sort of a human perspective, stink bugs are probably the worst, which you got to get on top of stink bugs straight away. So quite susceptible to pests and diseases. So you've got to be active in terms of monitoring it, and then how are you going to treat them? Well, a few different ways, right? You can prune stuff out. So things like leaf miner. If we've got some leaf miner here, we're just going to prune that leaf out, and we're going to dispose of that. We're not going to let it drop onto the ground. You can do that with aphids and other stuff as well. So pruning is one element. Another treatment is the application of a horticultural oil. And generally, if you're going to be spraying, you are going to be on a regime of maybe once every sort of 10 days, 14 days, something like that. Remembering as well that horticultural oil is sort of it's non-selective, so it sort of catches our beneficial insects as well. And then thirdly, just try and keep your plant in as healthy a condition as possible. So that takes us back to those inputs, and that means it'll be best able to both fight off pests and diseases, but then also recover when it is sort of inevitably attacked. Okay, so keep the plant in as healthy a condition as possible. Okay, so that's point 4. I hope that hasn't put you off the idea of having a backyard citrus. You have got to. It's an evolving plant. Okay, you can't just pop it in and leave it, but there's a satisfaction from being active and managing, for example, things like pests and diseases. So fifthly, if I haven't put you off, which hopefully I haven't, And you've heard all everything that's said, and you think, yes, come on. Where do you start? I'm going to head off to the garden centre this weekend. What should I be buying? Right. So if you're going for a lemon, I'd really recommend starting out with a Eureka or a Maya lemon. If you're going for a lime, I'd really recommend a Tahitian lime. And then just sort of finishing up with a sort of couple of practical tips. So you've been and bought it. When you're planting it out, try and sort of plant it out in a sort of a convex bulb on top of the garden. That really just helps with drainage. Or if you've perhaps got a slight slope, again, they really like being just on a slight slope. It just helps with drainage, making sure that the roots don't get too wet. And then also when you are planting out, just make sure, so its feeder roots are very sort of high to the ground, and they don't like competition at all. So just make sure around the canopy, sort of below the canopy, that's where your feeder roots are going to be. Just make sure that that's free of any other sort of weeds or other plants or anything like that. They'll really thank you for not having any sort of competition for those feeder roots. Right, that's it. Video over. Hope that's been helpful, and see you next time on Gardening with DC.